If your goal this year is to become a 3D artist, to build an impressive portfolio, grow an audience, land some commissions, and maybe even pivot your career fully into 3D art, then you're in the right place, because in this video, we're going to review why you just might want to change the way you approach learning 3D, especially when it comes to YouTube. So in order to do that, we'll explore first why YouTube, at least for me, was the worst way to learn 3D, how it compares to the expensive art school route I opted for instead, which really isn't what you'd expect. And finally, I'll be introducing you to a guide I built for you that lays out exactly how I would have gone about learning 3D, knowing what I do now after having invested 3 years, thousands of hours, and over $25,000 in that education to get to where I am today. That path did lead to some incredible milestones. My first student portfolio work getting recognized and shared by Adobe, growing an Instagram audience to over 100,000 followers, and now getting more commission requests than I can keep up with. It's a journey I'm deeply proud of, but I'm also extremely cognizant of the fact that while this was the right path for me, there's a significant portion of that investment in both time and money that could have been completely avoided if I'd only had this guide back then. But before we get to why that is and how you can avoid those costs in your own journey, let's take a step back to see how my own experiences shape the advice and guide I'll share later in the video, by first exploring why YouTube was the worst way for me personally to learn 3D. If you want to become a 3D artist just like I did 3 years ago, and like me, you're not looking to simply click along with some tutorials and render out some images that might impress your friends on Instagram, but to really become an employable 3D artist that is able to make a living and then some from your art, there's a lot to learn. And the good news is you can learn literally everything you need to know with YouTube and maybe a few paid tutorials. I would imagine most of you probably generally agree with that statement, since we've all heard time and again how the wild growth of freely available content has changed the education landscape to where you can viably learn anything you want to online at this point. The catch, I believe, for new artists especially, is that that same sea of content, that endless potential of things to learn, is exactly what makes YouTube the worst way for many to learn 3D art. As it's evolved, YouTube is now better than ever at pushing and pulling you through that endless web of content based on whatever the algorithm thinks will keep your watch time up. Though I've discovered some amazing creators and content thanks to that invisible hand behind the scenes guiding me through these recommendations and up next videos. This experience to me almost felt antithetical to what a structured, directional learning path would look like if I wanted to get serious about learning 3D art faster. To build on that, as seasoned or trained professionals, it's easy to look at YouTube and all of the courses available on ArtStation and Gumroad and be able to connect the dots backwards in a way that could reverse engineer a good portion of the knowledge they have now. But as a new artist, one of the biggest challenges in getting started was that I didn't have the benefit of that hindsight. I just didn't really even know what I needed to know, which is what keeps so many new artists like me stuck in loops, bouncing from one video or tutorial to the next, creating a few decent renders, but over time never really discovering the way forward or finding ourselves effectively moving towards a professional portfolio, paid gigs, or landing a job. That isn't to say it's impossible. Plenty of extremely dedicated self-taught artists have done it, but if they're being honest, despite the platitudes around there being value in failures since they're what shape us as creatives, I'd argue there's equal value in making sure that when we fall forward, and that when we fail at things worth failing at, so that the lessons we spend time learning are relevant to our goals as opposed to distractions or diversions. Fortunately, I was able to recognize the learning loops I had found myself in after only a few months, thanks to having already worked as a self-taught creative in the tech industry for the better part of a decade and having been through that cycle before. I was also at a stage in my career where I felt comfortable recognizing the external value that attending an art school might introduce as opposed to going it alone, particularly when it came to adding a structure and framework for my learning that could help me concentrate my education and make the most of my very limited time I had available while working full time. Which of course brings us to that second part of my journey where, after some digging around, I discovered the Rookies list of top 3D art schools, a few of which offered remote learning. Now, before you click off this video, assuming I'm about to suggest a school as the solution and better alternative to YouTube, stick with me a second as we fast forward to present day, where between my partner and I, we've invested over $25,000 in 3D game art education on programs like Gnomon, CGMA, and both of the full 16-month programs at Think Tank, her on the 3D character art path and myself focusing on environments. And after all of that, I can confidently tell you, while 3D art school has its benefits, it is not the answer, at least not for everyone, and certainly not without some major caveats and considerations to be aware of. To be clear, I don't regret the investment at all, but would absolutely do it differently given the chance, which is what I'm hoping to pass on to you. If we break down our experience in these programs and how their benefits and drawbacks compared to our self-taught education on YouTube prior, there are 3 distinct areas to be aware of. The third leaving the biggest room for improvement, and is something our guide tries to tackle head on. But before we break down those 3 main differences, I want to quickly acknowledge the cost of these programs, since I believe it would be an oversight to not at least address it. The reality is, not every student can afford $600 to $1,000 for a single CGMA course, or the $15,000 it would cost to attend the entire program at either CGMA or Think Tank, let alone the $100,000 plus tuition for Gnomon. In my case, I was extremely fortunate that I even had the option to attend all of these schools in some capacity, and Think Tank in its entirety, thanks to the position I was in after a decade in the industry, all while living fairly economically. So yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge that, since it isn't one of the 3 core differences we'll be going through now, but it was a major driver for me in wanting to create the guide I'll be sharing with you in a few moments. Okay, so the first and maybe most obvious benefit that most people expect from investing in an art school is the name recognition on a CV, and maybe to a lesser degree access to its student network. The value for this type of thing is always up for debate and could probably use its own video, but as a quick TLDR on my take and experience when it specifically comes to 3D art compared to many other industries, I feel there's a huge range of perceptions on its value, from students to seniors to hiring managers or clients. So your mileage will likely vary completely depending on what your goals are, where you'd want to work specifically, and maybe even whoever the individual is doing the first round screenings if you're looking for a studio job, for example. I will say more concretely, while individual course certificates probably don't carry much weight really anywhere, finishing full programs at schools like Think Tank or Gnomon will potentially get you and your work noticed and potentially amplified, as long as you have excellent work by platforms like the Rookies, since there has been a certain degree of trust and expectations, and let's face it, relationships built up over the years of great work coming out of these programs. So while it may be an indirect route to opportunities, I do think there is some value to be unlocked there for some people. When it comes to student networks, getting access to closed student and alumni groups in Discord or Slack, and being able to learn alongside other students who have high degrees of motivation, fueled by often large sums of tuition on the line, does feel like it has a particular momentum and energy and support system that does a bit outweigh what I've experienced in public groups. But as with anything, the value of this is completely dependent on your individual ability to put in enough effort to get that value back out of it. So in my experience, there were plenty of students who didn't capitalize on this one as much as they could have. The second major difference is gaining access to live sessions and mentors, where YouTube provides an entirely asynchronous experience with static videos and a comment feed for questions that hopefully get a community or creator response. The programs I experienced, on the other hand, though still relying on pre-recorded content, had the added benefit of weekly meetings with your classmates and mentors to ask questions and get clarifications on whatever it is you're learning. This added benefit at first sounded ideal, since mentorships are something that I'm a huge proponent of, as they can have profound impact on the growth of a new artist, though from my experience their impact is largely at the mercy of the systems in place around them, driving the quality of that time spent together. While I did have excellent experiences in these programs with my mentors, especially as I got to the end of the Think Tank program, I want to get back to this in a few minutes when we go over the guide I built, because there was an unfortunate cascading effect holding back these mentor sessions that stemmed from the course content itself that left major room for improvement in this area, which is a good segue to that third and final area, which of course is the content itself and the curriculum that delivers it. Now, going back to what I touched on earlier in the video, for me, the primary motivation for investing in art school wasn't getting access to that curriculum and content. Being part of these programs meant my learning journey was meticulously structured, introducing topics in a deliberate sequence designed to build upon what came before. This structured approach is what sets it apart from the scattered experience of learning through YouTube, where it's easy to bounce between videos that miss the mark in terms of skill level or relevance. When it came to the course content itself, the depth and production quality of the materials reinforced my belief in the benefits that paid content can at times offer over free tutorials. Unlike the vast majority of free tutorials available online, which tend to either skim the surface of a topic to attract the widest possible audience or simply serve as lead-ins to paid courses, the content in these programs is designed to offer a deeper, more full experience, for lack of a better term. This depth is only possible because the commissioned creators and in-house instructors are afforded the time and resources to dive deep into their subjects without having to worry about generating ad revenue through broad appeal and views or holding back more detailed information for gated paid-for segments. However, despite the undeniable quality of the content, my classmates and I couldn't help but notice that the pace at which the industry evolves often outpaced the update cycle of that course material. This disconnect led to most of us needing to very heavily lean on sourcing more up-to-date information and troubleshooting our issues with YouTube and other free or paid tutorials outside of our primary learning curriculum. I must admit that since this was my primary motivation for attending these schools in the first place, I was extremely frustrated at this experience at first, but over time it started to dawn on me that there might be something to that mixed approach that could be spun into a new way of learning 3D art that would help students get more out of both YouTube and other paid tutorials on ArtStation and Gumroad, but also help students who still plan to attend these programs, which is why I built and am finally happy to introduce you to what I've rather functionally named the 3D art curriculum. Even though the name implies generally what it is, essentially what I've done is tapped into that earned hindsight belonging to trained or experienced artists that I mentioned earlier. But instead of creating a proprietary set of content from scratch, I instead went out and curated all of the best content I could find from around the web, both through free and paid tutorials that together could mirror the overall learning journey I went through the past 3 years studying 3D. While it's in no way a direct replacement for a formal education like I experienced at those institutions, for instance, it certainly won't account for the name recognition on a CV or introduce the pressure cooker that is deadlines, which is crucial and something I'll come back to at the end of the video. It does offer alternative solutions to things like closed student networks, as well as, I'd argue, a better approach and timing for how and when to take on a mentorship, which I'll cover a bit later. But most importantly, I think it majorly improves on the actual thing I cared about most, dated content and the curriculum itself. Like I mentioned before, the curriculums and content these programs offer have undeniable upsides, but they also have the major downside of being incredibly slow and expensive to create, meaning they're nearly constantly out of date. Today, the processes, pipelines, and tech in game dev and film move fast, and I can imagine this trend will only get faster. So the only way I could find to account for that was to harness the collective efforts of all of the creators online by pointing you directly to them and their content. This approach gives the 3D art curriculum the luxury and nimbleness of not having the overhead of creating all of that content from scratch, which in turn allows my partner and I to dedicate our energy to reviewing and sourcing and vetting the content for the curriculum that reflects literally today's state of the 3D industry. It also has the benefit of not being tied to specific admissions periods or terms, meaning we can update it live at any time. So if a major update comes out that shakes up, say, the process of retopo or UV, we can just pop in a few links and explanations of what's been changed, and students would have immediate access to that updated content. When it comes to the structure of the 3D art curriculum, it largely reflects our own experiences and learning journeys, but improves on them, in our opinion, by taking into account all of the student feedback that we witnessed during our times in these schools. If you look at our program here, you can see it kicks off with something unique compared to those other programs, with something we're calling a term 0, where it introduces more holistic topics related to life as a student and as an artist, as well as, of course, recommendations on how to facilitate that student network experience that we found at the programs we attended. From there, it moves into a jumpstart term designed as a crash course into core software packages, which is something that our fellow students and us felt was really missing context-wise in those other programs. And then of course, in subsequent terms, moves its way through the basics and into more advanced topics related to different pipelines or processes, especially related to game dev. Finally, it concludes with coming full circle back to art foundations and talking about industry readiness and mentorship options and suggestions to again echo the importance of those that I mentioned earlier in the video. For now, the curriculum is primarily built from our own experience as 3D artists for games, with a particular leaning towards props and environments as my partner is still finishing up her character art studies. However, regardless of whether you want to move into film or a different targeted focus area, if you're new to 3D, I still think this is an excellent option to kickstart that process, as it covers everything from the basics of modeling and texturing through to Unreal Engine 5 lighting and scene setup. So regardless of your intended career path, definitely still give it a look. And for those of you who are still considering a program like Think Tank, Gnomon, or CGMA, if I had the opportunity to go back 3 years ago, I still would invest in them again. However, I would absolutely diligently go through this entire curriculum and the content recommended within it first. It will completely transform your experience at those schools so that from day one, you can begin making the most of the time with your mentors, where instead of spending thousands of dollars for IT support or learning software basics, you'll instead be in a place where your conversations revolve around them pushing your art direction and creative sensibilities, which is 1,000 times more valuable. Finally, since I'm sure many of you have been wondering if this has all been an attempt to justify the price of the curriculum as a premium course, I have to be honest that I have no idea how to price it. I think if you were to click into any one lesson and evaluate it at that level, the direct value would be hard to see, since after all, from a reductionist point of view, it's just a huge compilation and breakdown of YouTube videos and tutorials and courses. However, on the other end, if you zoom out and view it for what it could offer a dedicated student that fully worked their way through the intended order and path prescribed in the curriculum's current set of 118 lessons, I think it can contain huge value. For those who entirely dedicate to it, who are able to self-motivate deadlines and to follow along with all of its recommendations, I would be highly surprised if the end result were much different than attending one of these schools. There is something to be said for the odd relationship and value placed on things we spend a lot of money on, like these high-end schools, that I think might elicit naturally higher engagement and dedication. So it will require a high degree of self-motivation to get that same impact. But the psychology of that aside, and getting back to the point, I have to be honest, I don't really know how to price it. So I just figured I'd level with you all. I really wanted to just drop this for free to make it as accessible to the largest amount of people possible. But my honest fear with that is that my partner and I wouldn't feel as motivated or obligated to continually refresh the content as the industry moves forward, which would dispel its benefit in the first place. And on that same note, very practically, we might reach a point where we wouldn't be able to keep perpetually investing our own savings into new courses on a regular basis, which is something that we would very much like to do to keep the curriculum alive and current. So at launch, we've placed a $5 tag on the curriculum. If this curriculum gets enough traction, this will help us evaluate and vet more premium courses to see if they're worth integrating back into the program without having to rely on sponsors or tipping into our own savings more than we already have. If for whatever reason that $5 tag is still prohibitive for you, just please reach out to us on email or in a DM on Instagram, and we'll drop you a code to get free access, no questions asked, since we want everyone to have access regardless of their financial situation. But if you are interested and you find value in it and you're able to support our efforts with the $5, we're very excited to keep investing it back into the curriculum development. So yeah, with that, please feel free to click the link in the description to check out the curriculum. And if you have any questions or feedback, don't hesitate to reach out to us. And until then, thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next one.